Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at Tanchjim's Ola. So Ola is their brand new single dynamic driver set. It is very affordable at $40, and I do want to thank Hifigo for sending this review sample to me and supporting me over the past couple years with review samples. So do check them out on Hifigo's main website, and I also have a link where I bought it, which was actually on their Amazon store. So $39.99, and do take a look at that. So for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to get a close-up look at Ola, it is super tiny and super lightweight. Very attractive, design on the shell. Quite unique. You don't see this one too often. And I think the design comes along with some drawbacks. And obviously it's hard to get a driver tuned in a shell that is this tiny. And the weight itself gets caught up in the cable. So lots of little small nitpicks about doing a design that looks amazing, but perhaps functionally it's a little more troublesome. So third thing, the lip on this nozzle. So the nozzle is kind of short, but the lip is actually a little bit big. So if you're going to put expensive tips on this guy, like I had Aslas on this one, be super careful about pulling them off, because this is kind of a bigger lip and there's a sharp bottom to it, and the Aslas really hold that really tight, and pulling them off, be really, really careful about ripping your expensive tips on that guy. So do think about that. It also does come with a nice pouch and the box. So thank you to Hifigo again for shipping that one out to me. So let's kind of jump into the elephant in the room and talk about the graph and this tuning. And I think Tanchjim really kind of bit off a lot doing a very mid-centric neutral tuning at $39.99. At a budget price, to pull off a tuning that requires a very high attention to detail and balance and time and driver quality, I think this is a very difficult thing to pull off at budget prices, and they certainly took a whack at it. But from my point of view, why are V-shapes a little more popular in a budget area? One, people like a little more bass, and that's sort of one reason. But two, you can hide a lot of driver problems by bumping the bass, letting it bleed into the mids. It covers up a lot of mid problems. Bump the treble, you kind of had the same effect. Roll off the treble if it doesn't sound all that nice. You have lots of room to play with either side, and your mids sort of ride along with, these kind of tuning by edge cases like that. So you can fix some mid problems just by doing that. But in this kind of tuning, where everything is essentially kind of flat and neutral, super, super difficult, because you are hearing, pretty much the raw mids. There is no real color from either side, or at least that was the intent. So yeah, I think your mids have to be 100% tuned to almost perfection. Your vocals have to be absolutely nailed to really pull off this with this level of bass, which is adding almost not a whole lot to the mids at all, and a treble which is sort of supporting the mids and not really emphasized at all. So yeah, I think super, super difficult tuning to pull off. Not very popular, especially in the budget area, seeing too many sets that are tuned like this, and I think that's sort of the obvious reason is you need a super high quality driver and a ton of time to get this to sound natural. So props for them for giving that a whack. So let's kind of jump into it. And so the first thing, like I sort of talked about, the fit. This small shell with this kind of nozzle, the fit is kind of wacky. And the cable itself, actually, because the shell is so lightweight and the ear hook is so springy, it definitely tries to pull it out of your ear. So I sort of don't suggest using the stock cable, and you need tips that are really going to stick it in your ear. And that's just to kind of hold it in your ear. Once you get to having this thing stuck in your ear, either with the stock cable or your upgrade cable, there's sort of three versions of the sound, and those are why people sort of said you have to get the fit right on Ola, because there's a version of it, especially if you use foam tips, there's a more bass version. You can look at this and and say, well, it actually sounds a little more bassy. I mean, there is a slight little mid bass bump to it, and you definitely should hear that. But as far as sounding like a bigger bass than what it shows, I wasn't a huge fan of that sound, and it's not that hard to get Ola to do that with some foam tips. To me, it sounds a lot like BL03 with ill-fitting tips. You get a little more bass, but your mids lose all the resolution. They sound super low res. And then where the gain area, something went wrong there too. All the voices sound super thin. So BL03 actually had a similar problem. If the tips fell too far down on the nozzle, you get something that sounds similar to the BL03, but some of the peaks and bass were off. And I would say that's exactly what I heard with the more bass version of Ola. I just didn't like it at all. It sort of was frustrating and drove me nuts because of the low resolution to it. It really shouldn't sound like that. It should actually sound bass light, open, mid-centric, a little dry and technical, and I think that sounds the way the graph looks to me anyway. The problem, of course, with that is it's a little bass light, but you get big open mids, and it's a little dry. There's just really not enough bass bleed there to really warm it up. But it does give you a more technical presentation. I think that's sort of what the intent was. So my version that I sort of listened to this with was go with a good fit to get sort of that B sound, the open mid-centric sound, but then EQ just to give your sub bass a little more boost, and that gives you what I would call details plus some deeper bass, and that was the way I enjoyed Ola. So reverse Tanya, I would say that this one sounds much better at low volume. Tanya sounded much better at higher volumes, and they basically are inverses of each other. So where Tanya was, you would have to increase the volume to get the mids a bit forward to catch up with the bass and the treble. When everything was sort of at the right level, you were at a pretty high volume. Ola is actually different, and it's the reverse. If you start out at too high a volume, your upper mids, this whole gain area sounds too bright, this whole area sounds too bright, and lowering the volume sort of brings this down to a reasonable level, and then your vocals sort of come along with the bass, which is at a light level, and the treble too. So it's the reverse of Tanya. So these vocals sort of start out too high and too bright, and you have to lower the volume to kind of bring them back down, whereas Tanya was the reverse of that. So I would call this a medium volume at best set for longer sessions. I really couldn't take too much volume on this one at all. I actually kept on lowering the volume because it sounds much better at low volume. And do go with your warmer source and EQ. Like I said, it's got a bit of a dryness to it. It's got a more technical presentation to it. It just sounds a little better, a little more likable with a warmer source. So sound, like I said, it's all mids, very much a mid-centric set. Not a whole lot going on here to add any of the low end, and this is almost a very gentle neutral arc to it, so not a whole lot of boost at all to the treble. So I would call it all the mids with a small side of bass, and small volume will go pretty far. It's neutral or neutral bright depending on your volume. The more volume you give it, the more bright it gets. Sharper instruments do sound and align well with this set and this technical presentation. Sort of think about acoustic guitars, things with sharper attack. I think all those instruments tend to sound pretty good. But vocals themselves sound a bit detailed, but too sharp or digital or nasal, and that's a little bit of the volume and a lot of coloring that comes across with this, depending on where your volume is. The higher volume you go, the sharper this whole area gets, and that wasn't really my favorite, and that's why I keep on saying it sounds much better at lower volume, and vocals sound much better at lower volume for that simple reason. So the bass, I would say what is there sounds pretty good. It's punchy and it's textured. It just doesn't have the depth to sound natural, and there's sort of no hiding that. You can kind of see this roll off in the graph. You get this sort of small bump, and then it does drop off at 55, whatever that number is, that it starts to roll off. So think about where you prefer your bass lope to go, and I would certainly EQ that. Somewhere between 150 is when you see a lot of sets do a little up ramp in bass, and I think that does Ola quite well. So not enough bass to really bleed into the mids and add some needed warmth. Do add a EQ low shelf, 5 decibels or so at your preference between 50 and 100, like I said. That will give you some of that rumble that it's missing, and do that instead of using foam tips, which is going to affect other parts of the sound signature. So the mids, which should be the showcase here, they are big and open and clear and a little bit sharp. It does have this technical analytical sound to it because there's not a whole lot of warmth to it. It is definitely pitched towards people who are seeking that. And like I said, it does work quite well with acoustic versions of your favorite tracks. The upper mids definitely will let you know when the volume is too high. And for me, it kept on reminding me to lower the volume. So for me, it really just comes across as more technical than natural. It's very hard. At some point, you're lowering the volume so far down that you can't hear the detail, and that's sort of where the vocals sound a little more natural. And when you turn them up, too detailed, too sharp, too much of it is colored by the 2K. And this whole thing is all about tuning and balance, and this is super, super difficult to pull off that much gain with, so little low end to it. I think our voices, particular voices, don't really sound like that. They all have a high and a low end, and it's just super difficult to pull this off and sound balanced and natural on the vocals. On instruments, it actually sounds a little better, and I much prefer not hearing vocals on my tracks on this set in particular, just because the balance was thrown off for me. If you like brighter vocals, then it probably works pretty well for you. So treble in a mid-centric set, the bass and the treble should really support the mids, and that's exactly what they do here. There's actually really good extension. It actually does arc down quite nicely. It's not elevated, it's not boosted, it's not distracting, it's not harsh or peaky. This part is actually quite good, and it does support the mids just like it should. So yeah, I think they sort of nailed that part. And it very much neutral, no boost, extension, and it does layer on the mids quite well. It's definitely, while the mid should have been the best part of the set, I think the treble actually ended up being the best part of the set. The gentle arc on the graph is how it sounds. It's not peaky and harsh, like I said, and cymbals, just like the general sound like I'm talking about, it has a detailed sound to it. It's a little sharper, maybe a little analytical, and a little bit thin. Again, it's just really hard to pull off even cymbals if they don't have any body to them or any low end to them. If they sound a little too neutral bright as opposed to neutral, they're just a little off for me. So stage, again, this part I think is kind of a little bit of the design on the shell. I think that's one of the trade-offs. A little harder to get a big stage with that kind of signature, this kind of acoustic cavity. So the stage ends up being okay. It's mostly between your ears, and it does feel like it makes very good use of the space in between your ears, and it does have a little depth to it, a little height to it, a little width to it. The separation and layering do work well in that space. So yeah, it's not really a huge problem. It just needs to be bigger, but what it does have is actually pretty good. So separation and layering work really well in that space, and there's just tons of clarity, just not really any bleed to it. Lots of mids, so lots of clarity, slightly bright mids, all those things work in your favor for separation and layering and having enough space. So yeah, I think it generally works pretty good. Just needs to be a little bigger and a little out of your head, and but that's sort of the trade-off at $40 on a shell like this. And like everything else on this, it just works better at lower volume. The more treble you have, the flatter it gets. And so if you notice the stage is sort of a little too in your face, you're probably listening to it too loud. So notch it down a little bit. So that's all I got on Ola. Again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.